So, hello everyone, just Steelfur here doing another video on L5R. Something a bit different today, rather than my usual episodes where I just rant about things for an hour or so. I'm doing an interview with the man himself, Tyler Parrott, who is, of course, the designer of L5R. So thanks, Tyler, for joining me.
Yo, I'm happy to be here.
Great! Very nice painting behind you as well, which I assume is some sort of space thing.
I don't know. Actually, since you're asking about it, one of my friends uh, got it for me as a wedding slash housewarming gift,
Okay.
and no one's really sure what it is, but it's like some artist at some point painted it
Yeah.
and then like gave it to their friend, and then their friend gave it to another friend, and every single person that it's passed through has left
Okay.
a note on the back.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's got this cute little history of like all of the households it's been in
So it's kind of
on the
like
back.
re-gifting, but in a cool way, you know. Is it a
Exactly.
let's pass this on? Like the Traveling Pants? Was that a film? It's something about traveling pants. There we
The
go.
Sister of the Traveling Pants is
Yeah.
something. Yes.
There you go. So I guess our main topic of discussion today is the corset. It's kind of something that keeps coming up in discussions that I thought might be a good idea to sort of sit down and talk about. The main thing
Yeah.
that prompted that is, I mean, we're 3 years into the game. If you look at a modern meta deck, corset still makes up quite a significant portion of the deck, and that's quite an interesting thing, really.
And I know you have some opinions about
Well, I have opinions about it. I've
that.
already done a video on it. I guess the main thing. I mean, let's talk about the fact that 50% of current meta is core. Is that a good thing?
Honestly, it entirely depends on your point of view. If you're a new player, it's great because it means you can jump right
Okay.
into the thick of things. If you're an enfranchised player, it's not great because it means that you're still playing with the same cards you were playing with a year ago. Um, and even in there, it also depends. Are you someone who likes the core set cards? If these are all cards that you really like to play with, if you really, if Display of Power is one of your favorite cards, like then yeah, you're going to be happy that you still get to play it all the time. Whereas if you're more excited by the new stuff, then the fact that the new stuff struggles to be the fact that the new stuff struggles to be strictly more powerful than a lot of the core set cards isn't as exciting because it means that it is you have to work harder to put the new cards into your decks, whereas the core set cards are just like it does a thing, it does the thing that you want, and it always does the thing that you want.
Yeah, this is something I thought is quite interesting because if you look at a card game, and I mean, obviously you've got Magic, the elephant in the room, or Behemoth, or Leviathan, or whatever you want to call it, and obviously, usually in a core set design, the core set has weaker versions of cards that later then get enhanced versions. Because obviously, if you have that power level high at the start, it's hard to design effects that are not power creep, but also provide a strong alternative. So the example
Yep.
would be your 2/2 who taps for 1 mana, and then your 2/2 who taps for 1 mana and gets +1/+1 and trample. The ramp in card games is noted. But when we ran a recent event where we took out, for example, the bonsais, the court games, those sorts of
How'd
things,
that go?
well, as you might expect, Unicorn just trampled over everyone because they come
Because
in
they
with,
have the equivalents of those cards in Clan.
but also they have the attachments, they have the natural red numbers to just put 16 force on the board for a conflict, and you have no counter to that in terms of your own buffs. Oh, the cats.
Hello,
So
friend.
I was
Hello.
promised cats on this stream.
I wanted to walk across the keyboard, and Tyler wouldn't let me.
Yeah, well, that's probably for the best.
Um, so the thing about the power level of core set cards versus newer cards is like obviously in theory the optimal way to do things is to have here's the generic version of the ability, and it's like maybe slightly below par, but it always does what you want and it always does it in an
Yeah,
efficient way. And then the slightly better version is the like, okay, maybe this one is in a particular clan, and so it is slightly better and it has that clan's theme attached.
yeah,
Or maybe this one is from the new cycle and it's slightly better and it has the new cycle's theme attached. But the idea is that each of these variations on the theme um, is less universally valuable, but in the condition for that clan or that theme or whatever,
mm,
uh, it is better, right? Imagine if Bonsai was just zero fate plus two military,
yeah.
full stop. That's it. And
So
then
more
you
like
had
a
your
perfect
dragon
card.
version, which was 0 fate, +1 military for each attachment, or
Yeah.
the inheritance cycle version, which is also, I'll stick to dragon just for obvious sake.
Well, Rising Stars
Unique character
Carter, of
gets
course.
+3, or unique character gets +4, right?
Yeah.
Inheritance cycle cares about uniqueness, so we say it's better, but only for uniques.
Yeah.
Dragon Clan is about attachments, so it's better, but only if you have attachments, right?
Yeah.
In theory, that's the like ideal way to do things.
Yeah.
Now that gets a lot harder when you consider that like making a game that no one's played yet is really difficult.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And that's one of the reasons why it's actually fairly common for brand new games to have some cards that are just above the curve.
Yeah,
right.
For sure.
It's easy to compare Bonsai to some Magic equivalent. Let's say, using your ramp example, let's say Birds of Paradise.
Yeah.
Yeah, Birds of Paradise was in alpha. They would never print that card now. It's too good.
No.
And in the same way that I wouldn't print court games, right? I just wouldn't put it in a set if knowing how the game works now.
Yeah.
But that wasn't exactly known right before the game came out.
Exactly.
And another thing that I think is important about L5R is that the core game mechanics lead to a long, drawn-out, attrition-y kind of game. That's kind of the point.
Yeah.
That said, you don't want your games to be so long and drawn out. Like, if everything were super equally balanced all the time,
there'd be a lot more stalemates.
Yes. And in fact, I've seen that come up in playtesting sometimes, where it's like we've ended up with a collection of cards that are in this position where like neither player can actually win the game because my offense and your defense are exactly matched. And we just sit there, butting heads for 2 hours until one of us runs out of resources and dies, which frankly isn't all that exciting.
No, exactly. And there needs to be a certain amount of variance that pushes a player into an advantage and creates a situation where they will be forced to act because they feel like they are ahead, and therefore their opponent is forced to counteract. And it's true that powerful cards, push towards that.
Or vice versa, where you have, if I get a really strong lead, now there's this extra pressure on you to catch up.
Yeah.
And if you succeed at catching up, now we've created this story of going back and I started the game in the lead, and then you overtook me, and then I found the one card I needed at the right time, but it wasn't enough. And right? Like there's a story that we remember the course of the game that we can then tell it to our friends or encourage us to go play the game again.
Or it makes for good watching.
Create another story, right?
Yeah.
But that's why you see cards like that. I mean, frankly, that's why cards like Court Games and Bonsai exist, is because like the core premise of the game was play your character and then use lots of cards from your hand to try to win a conflict. But that each card would actually really matter, right? If Bonsai was just 0 fate +2 military skill, full stop, that's it.
Do you think, in some ways,
probably not good enough?
But the value of like cards mattering is somehow undermined by how many cards are drawn during the game? I mean,
well, that is all. I'm going to say that was an intended feature of the game.
Okay.
Which is that it's a weird thing to say. Like, it's clear that bid 5 meta, which is just everyone always bids 5 all the time under all circumstances,
which is changing
not
slowly, but it's still quite popular in many matchups.
Yeah. That obviously wasn't intended, because otherwise why have it dial at all? But the idea that we would both have big hands of cards and the game would come down to which conflicts am I going to spend how am I going to spend my resources? Does this conflict matter? Does that conflict matter? Do I need to get the break here, or is just winning the ring enough? These kinds of the game was always intended to be a game where you are a daimyo who has lots of resources, and the decision points are about where to spend those resources. And if you don't have a lot of resources to spend, you can't allocate them well because there's just fewer permutations. That's one of the things that a lot of people like about this game. But obviously, that's also one of the criticisms that people have had, which is why I created the skirmish format. But we won't get into that.
Well, that
right?
may come up later, but it is an interesting talking point, I think.
Yeah, but the idea that like we would both have big hands of cards, that we would then be playing a lot of cards throughout the game in various conflicts, like that.
Hmm. Yeah.
Advantage because that honor matters at least as much as the cards that the additional cards that you drew over.
Yeah,
That
exactly.
said,
That balance between honor and cards has always been the sort of key limiting factor in building those big hand sizes, which is why
yep.
they're now being punished more because there's more honor and dishonor tools in the meta, which means if you start the game with the idea that you're going to bid 5 the entire time, you're going to get knocked down a bit.
Well, yeah, and also I've designed more cards like Regal Bearing and Warm Welcome that actively punish people for bidding high or reward you a lot for bidding low, that kind of thing. But that's harder to do because like it needs to be really good to compensate for being down cards.
So, just sort of to pivot back to this idea of sort of core set and its ongoing impact on the game. And one of the things that when we were talking about setting up this interview was just think about, I guess, the ideas and how is core set being such a part of the meta such a problem, and if it is a problem, theoretically, how do you address this idea that stagnation is the wrong word, but sort of like the idea that these decks aren't changing as much as they theoretically could. Just in the realm of ideas, how do you address these sorts of things with an ongoing design? I mean, do you maybe at some point power creep Banzai out of certain decks, or do you address core itself as a product? I mean, that's quite a drastic step to take.
So it's basically not feasible for anyone in the gaming market to intentionally design a replacement for another product that they've already made, right?
Yeah.
Why would I spend money designing a product that is intended to replace a product that is already on the market?
Yeah, unless it's all out of print and it's a refresh, and yeah,
right. Unless the product is out of print and I'm not intending for people to buy it anymore, right? You have card games like Arkham Horror, Lord of the Rings, now Marvel Champions,
yeah,
which can very easily sustain a evergreen, I'll say, core set, because the intent is that it will just be reprinted indefinitely.
Yeah, and also because you don't care so much about balance. I mean, in Marvel Champions, for example, you print Thor; he's a bit underpowered compared to the other heroes. Then you print Black Widow; she's amazing, And then Doctor Strange draws 6 cards and deals 15 damage to his opponents in one turn, and you're just like, okay, what's going on here? But it doesn't matter because it's a co-op game. The second,
and co-op games also have the advantage of there isn't an expectation that new players have to buy all of it right away.
That's true. And I mean, Marvel Champions, for example, you buy one deck. In Arkham Horror, you've got the new starter decks that are coming out. And the idea of all of those is that here's a product I can give to my friend for 10 quid, and then they can suddenly play with me with all of my stuff that I've got. But of course, core in L5R doesn't fill that role because, and I think this has been addressed in a few places by the community, is even with Skirmish, which is a great thing, there are 2 issues. The first is that it's hard to build a full legal Skirmish deck out of one core, completely.
It's technically not possible, but you can get really close.
Exactly. And the other thing is there's no signposts to Skirmish in a core box or even near a core box as things currently stand. So, there's a few issues, I guess, there with core itself as a product.
The idea that that a game would be stuck with its core set, and in this case, I'm only talking about a competitive game largely comes down to the evolution of its player base. Right? Like the thing that people don't talk about with the Netrunner revised core set is that the Netrunner revised core set was kind of a happy accident. It was not intended to replace the core set. It was a situation of, hey, we're out of core sets. Let's print more core sets. And then someone somewhere was like, wait, what if instead of reprinting this core set that we know has flaws, what if we did a better version, right? Because we're reprinting it anyway, so we might as well improve it.
That old players may also want to buy. Because it had new arts and stuff in as well.
I mean,
which was,
that was an advantage to be sure, but the intent was always that there is going to be an entry point to the game, and because we're reprinting it, let's make it a better entry point. It was not a, hey, we recognize the flaws and we're going to replace it. It was there was already a need for additional products to fill that.
So I think that's an interesting clarification, because I think in the L5R community, a lot of discussion about new core is that, say, for instance, Netrunner got one because they needed one, and Game of Thrones got a 2.0 because Game of Thrones 1.0 needed a reset, when I think what you're trying to say is that Netrunner got one because it got lucky, and Game of Thrones...
Well, actually, Netrunner got one because it needed it, but it didn't need it for the same reason that people think that it needed it.
It needed it from a sales reason rather than a design reason.
It didn't... It happened that it needed both.
Yeah.
But you can't do one without the other, basically. Take the Lord of the Rings core set as an example. There might be a need to print additional Lord of the Rings core sets, but there is not a need to redesign it.
No.
So you're not going to redesign it. There might be a need to redesign the core set, but until there is a need to print more core sets, that's also not going to happen. Netrunner got both, right? Yeah. And hilariously, Netrunner not only got both, but it got both at the time that it most needed it, and it hit the market at exactly the right time.
Yeah.
Which was interesting to see, and heartwarming for those of us that like Netrunner.
Netrunner's fantastic. I sold my collection a few years ago, but I still play with some friends every now and then because it's a good game. But I guess that does present a unique challenge then for competitive LCGs, because you might know, but I don't know how well L5R is selling, how many products are left on the shelves. It's, stuff the community can't track, right? But in terms of the effect of the core set on the game now, and also, is the other thing I wanted to talk about at some point, which is the idea of time progression in the L5R universe. If the core set's going to be around for 5 or 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, until it all finally sells out, and then there's a reprint, rerun, and hopefully a redesign, those cards are never going to become less powerful. And some of them are already becoming less played, like Court Games is already becoming less played to an extent.
Which is wild to me, because that's the most ubiquitous card I can think of in the core set.
But if you're in Crab and you've got your Zero Glory guys, you might cut it in favor of something else. And Dragon cut it down to 2 because High Glory, but not as good as Kios. So there is some places where some of these cards are flexing. Bonsai down to 2, Court Games down to 2, but stuff like Imperial Storehouse, Favorable Ground, Mia Mystic, the Dynasty side almost has more offenders. Keeper Initiate, for example. So I guess
Keeper Initiate's hard to get rid of. I'll give you that. But a lot of those staples, even on the Dynasty side, are kind of only staples because there aren't other staples to compete with them. I am curious to see how many Favorable Grounds and Imperial Storehouses people run once there are additional staples to add to the deck, like a Season of War or Lost Papers. There are, because there's only so many non-characters you can put in your deck, despite what crab players think.
Though arguably Season of War and Lost Papers don't reduce the amount of don't increase the amount of characters you need to run, because they can flip characters.
Diminishing returns, though. That's the key.
Yeah, there is.
and like and obviously you can design powerful synergy packages to sort of push
Mm.
out, because again, people are pretty much only going to run 40 card decks unless you really give them a reason not to.
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
so like with a powerful enough synergy package, theoretically you can push out some of these staples, like what you were saying with Kihos and monks and
yeah,
tattoos, um, to the point where like I need 30 card package, and my other 10 cards maybe bonsai doesn't fit or whatever. So that is one way to do it. That's really the optimal way to do it.
yeah.
To address the power of core set cards through bans or restrictions is certainly
Well, it's suboptimal.
undesirable, but it is effective.
Yeah,
And I only say undesirable in the sense that like it looks bad,
yeah,
uh, and nobody ever wants to be told, hey, you can't play with this card that you might like or just bought.
yeah. I mean, it's a problem that Scorpion are having at the moment because they get a lot of good cards, and then a lot of their cards out of the restricted list, and it is starting to add up into a bad feeling, for example. And
Which then comes back to your point about power creep, which is like, yeah, there are occasionally cards that are just better than core set cards, and a lot of the times when that happens, the card ends up on the restricted list,
yeah,
right?
that's true.
So like there does seem to be a sense of there being a power ceiling
Yeah,
for L5R, in that if you make a card that is above the power level ceiling, then it's going to do one of two things. Either A, it's going to become so powerful that just playing the one card will invalidate most of the decisions that came before it,
yep,
which is not fun, which
no,
is not a fun feeling. Or it has to get banned or restricted, which is also not a fun feeling.
yeah. And a lot of that is set by just the mechanical hard limits of the game in terms of province strength, number of times you can use a character a turn, honor gain, honor loss, and the whole game
Yeah,
clock.
but that's also not really unique to L5R.
No, no, of
Like
course not. But
in any other game, um, you know, there's a card from a recent Magic set that every time it resolves, if my opponent plays it, I immediately concede because I just have no interest in playing against it. It's unbeatable.
yeah, well, that's why I gave up Magic a lot of the time. Is that you go up against the blue-white control decks, and it's like, okay, you've set up your thing now. I'm gonna go.
Good job. You got your dream trawler. I'm out.
Yeah, I'm gonna go make tea.
Right? Like so like clearly that is also the case for Magic or
yeah,
I don't know Game of Thrones.
I guess for L5R, it's more that there are more of them. You've got your upper honor limit, your lower honor limit. You've got your provinces. You've got too much defense, too much attack.
I'm referring to just the raw power level of a card, independent of the axis it's operating on.
Yeah.
Right? Obviously, I could print a card that said pay 5 fate, gain 5 honor, and that would be busted. But it would only be busted in one axis. But that doesn't change the fact that it is busted. A lot of things a lot of the feedback that I have seen and received from players over the years is very often that people will say such and such is a problem for the game, or such and such is bad design, or how did such and such get through playtesting, and perhaps most specifically, such and such isn't good enough, or such and such is a failure.
Yeah.
And
that happens more often than it should. Because
a lot of people, but what I've learned is that a lot of the times the feedback is not such and such is a failure because it's not fun. Such and such is a failure because it is not strong enough, and and the power level of a card is more important than the gameplay of it to me.
And I don't think that's fair. Because cards
card
need to
players
be
are going to be card players.
Yeah, but they need to be strong and they need to be fun. I think one of the biggest challenges people see in terms of L5R, and it sort of stretches beyond, is just in terms of like finishing synergies and the amount of cards that support a card. Like so, for example, the much maligned Wandering Goose Philosopher, who I know you know about, the best meme to come out of the Dominion cycle. The main reason I think that card doesn't get any sort of respect is mostly because dragons on reveal provinces don't really exist. I mean, if Resto was still the way Resto was before it had to be changed, then the goose.
Yeah, maybe we're talking about something different.
Exactly. But the on reveal provinces, there are I think 2 in Dragon. The Shinsei's Wisdom, and there was Restoration of Balance. So
is that it? I mean, but there's a lot of neutral ones too.
Yeah,
the neutral ones don't really matter. Like if you can resolve multiple night raids, that's good. If you can resolve multiple, the one where you get the attachment, the forge.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Is really good, right? Like in theory, the dragon flip over my provinces a bunch of times.
Yeah.
Theme or deck. It's fun. I've played it. It's very fun, and it presents an interesting strategy, and it feels like you're doing
odd stuff, dragon
odd,
stuff.
dragony stuff.
Yeah.
And the biggest criticism that has always been leveled against those cards from early in the Dominion cycle is just that they're not strong enough. Yeah. People want to play with them. People want to, but they feel like they can't because they're too weak. And it's like you can't get 100% success rate ever, right? In terms of
no, for sure.
I think we do a pretty good job, but like there's always going to be a few misses, and when a card is either way too strong or way not strong enough, then that eclipses the like how fun is it.
I guess no, but I guess a lot of the discussion I see is more about sort of like charting themes. So just to return to this idea of core set and its effect on the game, because there's something I want to chart, is that ideally in people's heads you're going to have a theme that's established in the core set for a faction. So dragon get weapons, dragon. I talk about dragon a lot. Dragon get monks, dragon get.
Dragon's easy because you both know the clan
well. Yeah, exactly, but also I think a lot of people see dragon's themes, and they can at least chart them. You've got hand control, you've got attachments, you've got all of these things, and then they want to chart a line through from the core set all the way through the packs that sees those themes supported, and then they'll see a new theme come out, like say Dragon Pack punched loads of cards, and then it doesn't get support, like because you immediately pivot to another idea.
I mean, that's one of the challenges of having 7 factions and 2 deck and 3 deck types, and right is that like it's hard. It's really hard to flesh out a card pool when there are so few individual cards in the game.
While also being interesting and adding new ideas as well.
And to get back to kind of what the topic of the day is, it is very in like the style of game that L5R is, this like lifestyle game where you collect your collection grows over time, and from month to month the game changes as cards come out or as people find new decks or that kind of thing. Like that really strongly pushes everyone involved towards wanting the game to change on a regular basis.
Yeah.
You don't want the game 3 years in to feel the same as it did on year 1.
Yeah, because it's not a board game you're picking up and playing a few times a month. It's sometimes a game you're playing every day, every few days, depending on.
I mean, every week sounds a little bit more doable to me, but maybe that's just my schedule.
I've met some people, right?
Oh, I believe it. But the most effective way to do that is to really actually do different things all the time.
Okay.
Right? Like if I just made, and sometimes I worry that Crane isn't diverse enough because like so many of their themes go back to, but I'm honored and that makes me cool. Whereas for all of its trials and tribulations, Dragon at least feels like it has different things going on, and that I can build different flavors of Dragon. And absolutely, I acknowledge that, like, maybe they're a little bit too insular and they could have a little bit more cross-pollination so that you could feel like your deck does more. But if your deck is just all of the best cards from all of the best themes stapled together, then does it really feel like it's evolving? Or is it just that, it's a new card, it goes in my existing deck, and now my deck hasn't changed for 2 years? And so there is a certain amount of just a need to be doing new things all the time. And the fact that the card pool is as small as it is because of the the 3 deck types and the 7 clans and the 130 cards per cycle. Like, it's just, there are limitations to that, and individual themes are really carried by individual cards. Like, the whole idea that monks matter is literally based on 3 cards from the elemental site. Now, we've seen more cards since then, or the idea that commanders matter, that's 2 cards. Literally, like, 2 cards have now made it such that multiple clans care about trying to put commanders in their deck. And that's cool. But the inverse of that is, if my theme is, flipping my provinces over a bunch of times and the cards aren't good enough, then nobody plays them in the whole theme, languages, because it really does come down to how effective those individual cards are. And since you can't, since you're never going to perfectly hit a certain level of balance for every card, there will be hits and there will be misses. Butcher of the Fallen is a little too good, right? Traveling Philosopher is a little too weak. And those are cards from this cycle that are coming out.
But this is, I suppose, that's the strongest argument then for that prevalence of core set in the decks, is that when 50% or so of your decks is still core set, you at least have that reliable core for any theme that you want to play with. Because if you want to lean your deck more towards military, you just chuck in more bonsai, or vice versa.
And the other advantage to that is that for a game like L5R, which more than every other game probably ever, really, really, really cares about the interactions between the clans, because it so strongly encourages players to play one faction and one faction only. Whereas, like, with Game of Thrones or Magic the Gathering or Netrunner even, like, there's no strong incentive for me to just stick to one color, or
you just play
one house.
Good decks, right?
Whereas in L5R, like, clan loyalty is a thing. And the idea that I'm going to only play Crane forever is a thing. So if I'm
Tyler,
playing,
where's my Mantis clan, for example?
right? But like, if I'm playing Crane only ever, and Crane is weak, then that feels bad, because I want to play good cards. But here I am stuck playing these bad cards. And I'll do it, but I won't be happy about it. And I want people to be happy, right? So there is this sort of expectation that all 7 clans are at least as close to on par with each other as possible. Really more so than any other game, although obviously every game wants to be balanced.
Which puts more pressure, of course, because it is just harder to balance.
But it also means that your core set can be a really good foundation. If 50% of all the decks are core set, and the core set is balanced, which frankly, with one glaring exception, it is.
Yes.
Then that means that if 50% of all the decks are core set cards, and all the core set cards are balanced, then you can at least expect that there is a certain level of
a fundamental core of balanced design across the game.
It doesn't mean that, like, because the alternative is here's a cycle where, let's say, Crab is really weak. For whatever reason, we over-nerfed Crab or under-pushed Crab or whatever, and now Crab is just really weak for this cycle. It means that Crab players aren't stuck being the punching bag clan for 6 months, because they can just keep playing their good core set cards. And it sucks that they don't get to use the new stuff, but at least they're not unplayable.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I definitely think that there is an argument for how it narrows the say the bell curve on power, just because there is a solid core of cards.
Look at what happened to Dragon. I unrestricted one card, and all of a sudden people are back to complaining about how strong they are.
Yeah, but is that because Dragon got better, or is that because policy debate is very good? I don't know.
It's because policy debate is really good, but also but it's also just the fact that, like, a lot of the recent Dominion cycle cards are kind of weak, but Dragon players still have a good deck that they can play, and so they can still compete in tournaments. Which Dragon, like, players want to be able to compete in tournaments, and they want to be able to compete with their clan. Now, would they prefer to do it with the new cards? Yes, but when imperfections occur in game development, then at least there's this fallback of, well, at least my core set cards are good.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fair. I mean, there are other So I mean, that's pretty much. I think we've kind of well addressed the design issues with Corset. Is that it's good and bad about having it around. I guess there is a discussion about new player pathways into the game that's kind of tricky. In that the one core set for skirmish argument is tricky. 2 core sets to build skirmish decks that are legal is tricky. 3 core sets to get into the main game is tricky. I mean, I don't know how you solve that though from a design perspective. I mean, we've had various ideas from the community. You know, L5R used to do 1 clan versus 1 clan starter decks, for example. And that would be your base entry to the game, and then you'd have to buy core sets anyway to get other factions. But like, all of those things, as you say, they subtract from this product that you've already put out there, which is tricky.
So, and to be fair, like providing alternate ways to get into the game is not inherently bad.
No.
It's only bad if it truly eclipses the core set. If I released a product that was like, buy this new product and don't buy the core set, that's bad.
But if you release, say, a Lion versus Crane skirmish deck that was 30 cards
sure.
and had enough cards that you just had to buy
60 card decks, right?
Yeah, or like had the equivalent of all of the core set for 2 core sets for Lion and Crane. And then if you wanted to play Lion or Crane, you could buy 1 core set. If you wanted to play 7 other factions, you had to buy 3, right?
Yep.
But that sort of idea.
The idea is solid. The challenging thing is that and I think that there's still a certain amount of experimentation in the LCG space necessary for this. Is like, you can't do what the Game of Thrones starter decks did.
Yeah. They also didn't necessarily they sold well, but they didn't sell uniformly.
And also it was like, it wasn't a new entry point. It was 8 new entry points.
Yeah.
And almost as bad, right? Yeah. Like it's all well and good if I make, a Crane versus Lion, dual deck or whatever. Well, but if I want to play Crane or Lion, then what do I do? Go buy the core set, I guess.
Yeah.
What happened to my cool, new, exciting alternate, entry point to the game?
Well, I mean, it always used to be justified because you'd pick a giant story moment between 2 clans, like say, because the oldest example is the Battle of Baden Pass, Dragon versus Crab, you know, and you printed this box which had a story insert and it had a really big loads of lore behind it, so people thought it was cool.
But also, you can't assume most game companies are not Wizards of the Coast, and the idea that you're going to release a product that will definitely for sure only ever be sold for a year or 2 is dubious.
Yeah, that's fair.
Even Wizards, I mean, if you look at the actual volume of products they put out, they just are putting out new content constantly.
Yeah. And they can because they have that large, ferocious appetite in terms of consumers who will buy.
But also their products. I mean, the whole customizable game idea revolves around the idea that like people are going to buy more than they need. Yeah. Right.
And the secondary market effect. Of course.
That's literally the customizable game model is I'm going to buy a booster pack and it's going to have cards in it, and some of those cards I want and some of those cards I don't.
Yeah.
And now, great for social gameplay, right? Because now there's the whole trading element.
But I'm eternally grateful we don't have to deal with that with L5R.
But it means individual player is going to be spending more on a collectible game than a non-collectible game. That was why the LCG model got invented.
Yeah, because it reduces overall spend, but it increases perceived spend, which is a tricky concept. But
but what it means is that LCG products have to be able to sell for a longer period of time than collectible ones.
And I think that's one interesting point that, because I noted, is that if you look at the time progression in the old L5R universe, we're talking about roughly 3 to 3.5 years per arc, per arc, And if you think about an arc in terms of 50 years, and the first few did just go like side by side, we one arc, then we had like a 10-year skip, and then later on there was like a 50-year skip. Whereas
here's the kids of the previous cast, and now we'll do the grandkids of the previous cast or whatever.
Exactly, and people resonate to that because L5R is in some ways about the characters we like, and in some ways it's about the heroic moments that they lead to that define their lives, I guess. and then moving on to the next generation, and they have their heroic moment that defines their life, and that's kind of the story of a hero. Sure, one character can have 50 heroic moments, but each of those heroic moments is diminished because they're not the life-defining moment. They're just, hey, look how awesome I am. I'm Yoritomo. I can fight 20 people at one time, But
and whereas the counterpoint to that is, if there's a character I really like, I don't want to see them go away.
Yeah, that's true. So I mean,
I know that one perspective that I had heard prior to about L5R early on was that I had friends who were like, "Oh yeah, I played L5R 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever."
Yeah.
And then I came back and all the characters were different, and I didn't care about any of the new ones because why would I? And yeah, that's reasonable. Because you're asking people to reinvest in new characters every few years. But like you said, then the alternative is to have the same cast of characters doing everything all the time. And then it's like, cool, the Hida Kisada sure saved Rokugan from 10 different threats. Good job, Kisada. Again? That's very believable because there's definitely going to be 10, world-ending threats in his lifetime or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. I guess the thing is, I mean, because it's
the comic book hero problem, right?
Yeah.
Is that the Avengers are constantly saving the world when it's realistically speaking, there wouldn't be that many threats for them to constantly be having to save the world.
I guess the question is how L5R handles it, because it kind of ties into the LCG model as well. In that the core set has its unique characters in. If the core set's going to be around for 7 years longer, until it reaches the natural end of its life cycle as a product. Yeah. You don't need to speculate on time. I'm just throwing out.
I know, and that's I think the healthiest way to look at it is there is no set timeline necessarily for the core set. It's kind of in the same way that there's no set timeline for the deluxe expansions. I mean, we were explicit about that of they're going to go until it's appropriate for them to not be there.
Yeah.
Now it's easier to rotate out a deluxe because it's not an entry point to the game.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? But it's also not. It will be replaced when it is most appropriate to be replaced, rather than us just saying, "And it's been 5 years, so I guess we got to do it because we said so."
Yeah. But I guess the question is, how do you handle, because the current progression of a story, and I actually looked into it, is we've got about 6 or 7 months in about 3 years, right? Which
we're looking at about 6 months, right? It started in, I think, early to mid-spring, and we're now okay, hang on, where are we actually? Autumn, I think.
Kaori has a calendar.
I'm in the future. I'm in the future, obviously, but I think with what's published, I think we're in late autumn.
Yeah. So in that context, the characters from the core set are going to be around for quite a long time if we continue at this pace. If we look at
assuming
they don't die. There's this idea that we could possibly have them around, and that's kind of important because if you're a new player and you come into the story and you want to know what's happened in the story, you want to see that Yakudi's still running around doing nothing, sitting on his mountain, speculating.
He's very hard.
He's just too powerful, It's like, why doesn't God interfere? It's like he can't do it because if he does, then there's no problems. Always the problem with the dragon. When your God is real, he can only do so much. But I guess what I meant was is that sort of progression in terms of game universe time in this one arc, which, obviously not to speculate on where it's going, but currently roughly around Clan War, and there's lots of previous inspiration for what comes next and things like that. Do you see that arc continuing for the life cycle of the game, like say with Game of Thrones, where it was a set arc, or I mean, is there more of an appetite to explore the universe of L5R beyond, say, the Scorpion Clan coup or where we currently are, or that sort of thing?
So here's the thing, right? Is and L5R is in this unique position where it has very L5R specific advantages and very L5R specific disadvantages.
Yeah.
For example, there are 7 clans and 7 great clans plus the Imperials plus the minor clans, and you want multiple kind of protagonists or key characters in each of those categories, which means kind of by definition an L5R story that is attached to its game, which is attached to its player base, which is factionalized,
Yeah.
really wants a huge cast.
Yeah. It ends
And
up
now
kind of being like Rainbow Warriors, Power Rangers sort of thing, you know.
And now the only way to make a huge cast matter is if each of them is doing interesting things, and the things that each of them is doing matter.
Yeah.
Right. I could tell a story about Daidoji. What's the Daidoji spy master with disguised? Anyway, disguised guy.
I mean, I don't play Crane, so
Kage, Daidoji Kage. I could tell just a story about him doing cool things, but if it doesn't matter in the larger sense of the story, why am I spending my screen time on it? And now the answer is because he's a cool character, we want to show him off, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But there is a very real limit to the number of stories of short stories that can be published. Yeah. That's just a fact.
Yeah, of course.
And so if I want to simultaneously tell an interesting story that moves forward and has consequences, has a cast of at least like 14 to 20 people, and I can only publish so many short stories per year, it means that either a lot of those characters aren't going to get screen time, or their actions aren't going to matter, or it's just going to take me a long time for the plot to move forward. Right. And that's kind of been the state that we've been in. Is the first 2 cycles did advance the plot, but not a ton. And it kind of wasn't until the end of the Imperial cycle, or so the Imperial cycle set up the Emerald Champion, and then the Elemental cycle, got us into the whole plot with the princes and the edict, and then you had cycle 3, which was the actual spoilers, Death of the Emperor. At this point, I'm just going to say L5R spoilers. I'm not going to try to censor myself.
I mean, that was about a year ago now.
Yeah, so. I don't know. People care. If you care, stop listening. And then we can keep going forward, but obviously the pace is by necessity slow, because there's so many characters that kind of are competing for screen time.
And I think it's interesting how it gets handled, because I mean, how it's handled, for example, I think how it was handled in Netrunner was that each cycle defined a specific period or place, and then you just had short stories that placed specific characters doing cool stuff in that setting.
But the disadvantage to that in terms of L5R specifically is that the Netrunner model that you just described is very like, you will see one character one time and they will do one thing and it may or may not matter.
Yeah.
Whereas that's not what people want out of L5R.
Well, it's very much how L5R used to be, was that most characters would show up for 1 or 2 short stories and then disappear. But there was a lot less and a lot good consistent fiction, which is the difference, right? You'd have a letter from an Imperial Herald that would tell you what had happened recently and what your clan had been up to, and then you'd get a short story which kind of placed that guy or someone in your champion or something in a fiction, and then they might come back for another few fictions. But the consistency is a lot higher. I guess that slows the pace down by virtue of...
And also it becomes difficult for those individual stories to matter, right? Yeah. Like the people grow most... Humans are most emotionally invested in characters that grow and evolve and have depth, right?
Yes.
And you can't get depth in one 3,000 word short story. You just,
especially in L5R, where this idea that we're going to see this current generation do their good thing and then, blaze out or something, maybe.
Right. Like, I'm partial to Kitsuki Chiari or whatever, right? But she's only been in one story, so I am not surprised if most people just kind of don't care. She's just that Kitsuki investigator person who got to do a cool thing once.
Yeah.
Whereas you're going to find a lot more people who are invested in characters like Doji Hotaru or Bayushi Shouju or Koro Toturi, right? These are characters who have been in many, many stories at this point. And now we've seen them do different things, and they've taken actions that have had repercussions that they've then had to react to. The thing that people remember about, say, Koro Toturi from the old game was that his story arc was he was the lion champion who was like really thoughtful
it was so
Phoenixy, and then he became a Ronin, and then he became an emperor, and like you don't remember the characters who did one thing one time. You remember the characters who had an arc.
I mean, his arc was quite long. It went,
sure, and that's why I'm using them as
no, I know. It's a good
but
example.
my point is, there's a limit to how many interesting arcs you can have with such a large cast. Now, this is only a problem in the context of trying to tell a linear storyline attached to a card game with a player base that's heavily factionalized.
Yes.
If we're just talking about Rokugan in general, it has huge advantages because we can tell more than one story in it, right? There's a whole bunch of novels that are going to be coming out.
I've seen those.
Whole novella, like a group of novellas that are, while relevant to the main plot, are much more self-contained. This idea that and not to mention the entire role-playing game, which is the whole premise is you can tell your own stories, right?
Yep.
Is Rokugan is so big that it is both a disadvantage because it makes it really hard to tell a story over a certain period of time with such a by necessity large cast, but it also has almost infinite potential for storytelling. There's no end to the number of novels that we could put out in theory with unlimited time and money.
True.
There's tons of interesting stories to tell in Rokugan, and that is an advantage. That's part of why the IP has been, so sound for so long. Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, kind of has a similar vibe, except that it's much more focused on its specific narrative, where Rokugan has always embraced the possibility of many.
That's true, and also just in terms of time. I guess the question is, so there are many ways of designing this sort of time progression and changing of characters into a game. You have the Game of Thrones approach where you just get 6 or 7 versions of one character, for example. You had the old L5R version, which was, that guy's gone, here's his grandkid, new champion, whatever.
Or even the experience
versions. Exactly, but the experience mechanic, they could be played alongside each other, but at some point the old version rotated out and the new version came in. And I guess the idea is, we've already got one character who's dead in story who is playable, and was dead in Coreset when she was printed. And that jars with... I know, but that jars with some people because she's never going to be more relevant than she was when she was printed. She's not the favorite crab because she doesn't stick around,
I mean, and I certainly can see that perspective, but I can't really apply much importance to it because that's been true for every game since the beginning of this whole hobby card game industry, right? Magic the Gathering still regularly releases cards for characters that died 20 years ago. I mean, Eddard Stark is treated... Okay, Game of Thrones spoiler. Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire.
I don't think it counts as a spoiler.
But Eddard Stark has been getting new versions of him that Eddard Stark is treated as much of a main character as someone like Daenerys Targaryen, who is all the way through to the current point.
Despite the fact that 20 years ago in a novel,
and so here's this character who one of the whole plot points of the series is that your protagonist dies at the end of book 1, and he continues to get new cards well after that.
But less more about the death and more about the progression. I mean, if you print Mitsu 1, you print Mitsu 2. At some point, Mitsu 3 comes along, he's older, he's learned a bit more. Does Mitsu 1 ever become unplayable? Or is that just taking away a toy from people that they don't need to lose?
The short answer is the latter. I mean, strictly speaking, if a game isn't fun and people aren't enjoying playing it, then it has failed as a game, regardless of how good its storyline is.
Fair.
Right? So if I make a fun card, I want people to play with it because it's fun. And really the only reason to rotate cards is to decrease the barrier to entry and for balance reasons.
Yeah, which is why you rotate cycles and not cores.
And stop printing product, right? The reason that rotation even started in Magic in the first place was in some sense because all of their sets were limited print runs, and at a certain point they were like, we can't expect everyone to be buying cards from Alpha because we stopped printing Alpha 5 years ago. Yeah, right.
We can't reprint Alpha because it devalues the cards.
Right, and so rotation is almost as much an answer to the question of logistics of
Yeah.
product logistics as it is the idea of like, well, there's this old card we don't want to play with anymore. That can be resolved with the ban list. You don't need
Yeah.
to rotate that. But also the idea that like you can very easily create the sense that characters grow and evolve and change by making new versions of the characters. And if I really like a previous version of the character, that doesn't devalue their growth. That just means that I liked them in book one.
Yeah.
Even if they're doing different things now in book three or whatever.
Yeah. So it makes more sense as a sort of continuous narrative where the characters are appealing at a specific point. It doesn't mean you can't reread the book.
Well, and also remember that like the whole point of a card game that has deck building, which L5R is that it puts the agency in the player's hands. If I don't want to play with the previous versions of Mitsu because the character has evolved and is a new person now, I have the ability to choose to not play those cards.
Or if you don't want to run Shuffles the Goblin because...
Right, or if you don't want to...
Shadowlands, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so, like, it would be, I'm not going to say irresponsible, but basically it would be inappropriate of me as the game designer to tell you, the player, what you can and cannot play with, because the whole premise of the game model is that you get to decide what goes in your deck.
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
Sometimes you have to make exceptions, right? That's why cards get banned.
Yeah.
But as a general rule, that is very, very not desirable for anyone. Yeah. I don't want to ban cards. You don't want your cards to be banned. Yeah. Because people want to play with the cards they have, and I want you to play with the cards that we've made.
Yeah.
And so doing so for pure theme reasons is overly prescriptive when that can be on you. I find personally some of the most fun ways to play these kinds of games is as what ifs, right? Like, obviously right now we have Agasha Sumiko and the Dragon supporting Bayushi Shoju and the Scorpion Clan Regency in fiction. So in theory, if I were to build a theme purist deck, then my Scorpion and Dragon cards would be allied together. But like, if I build a Dragon deck and you build a Scorpion deck and we play against each other and now we're fighting, that is a what if that does not occur in the story, but might inspire an equally interesting story in my mind that then now I can go become emotionally invested in because I got to see this alternate potential or whatever that was cool to me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Just trying to think if there was anything else in terms of time that I was going to ask about. Because it's just, I mean, it is interesting just how you keep the universe turning, I guess, when you own the whole universe.
And the other thing that I think is worth talking about, and this is something that card games with storylines have always struggled with, is the idea that card games don't play out in a linear way. I mean, games in general don't play out in a linear way. That's why they're replayable. But what that means is, like, if I have a story that I'm trying to tell and that story involves a linear progression of events, and I put all of those events even on cards in the same set, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to see those cards in that order.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Right. And so card games are a very, very, very bad way to tell linear stories for that reason. It's much easier to give like an environmental story of like, okay, yes, there's this whole plot going on about Prince Satori and Prince Daisetsu and whatever, and they're doing things or having things happen to them. And that's interesting and all interesting and well and good. But if we don't put those characters in our decks, then that kind of doesn't matter. Whereas if the story is instead all of the clans are at war with each other and themselves at the same time, there's no sense of direct progression there. And if that's the story that I'm telling and I can tell it on like 20 cards, And now it doesn't matter what order we see the cards in because they're all kind of giving different pieces of the same single story of all of the clans are at war. Um, and so, like, that's part of why card game narratives tend to be the way they are. That's usually why you don't see heavy narrative applied to individual cards or even collections of cards. Obviously, certain characters often will. You'll have Bayoshi Shoju is a regent, and that's why he doesn't let your opponent have the imperial favor or whatever. And also because he's sitting on the throne, he can't get into military fights or whatever, right? Like, that individual card tells kind of the story of what's going on with that character, but you're not going to see like, it's very rare that you would see 4 cards that very clearly depict a plot among each other, because during a game, those cards are not going to appear in that order.
Yeah, I think that's fair, though. I mean, the issue with, say, Shoju having a specific ability or those sorts of things kind of ties back into the only other really burning question about story related to design, which is just that the impact that L5R players expect to have on story progression, and then having that have a knock-on impact on cards, for example, which is a challenge, I guess, because...
It sure is. So remember how I said that there was a limited bandwidth to how many fictions we can produce? Well, there's also a bandwidth to how many cards we can produce.
Yeah.
And with a big cast and a particular story that we're trying to tell, obviously, I would love to give as many player-involved story choices as possible. But I don't want to give the players a reward that is ultimately meaningless. And either option A is we embrace the player involvement in the storyline wholeheartedly and say everything is a story choice, at which point there is no narrative direction, and the resulting story is going to feel not fulfilling.
I don't think anyone wants that.
It's simultaneously going in 20 directions because 20 different people got an input on it.
Yeah, and someone tries to appoint an elephant to be governor of the colonies, which is not okay.
Or you take the opposite approach, which is to heavily restrict the number of story choices so that when they do occur, you know they're going to matter.
Yeah.
Which is the direction that we've ultimately decided to take, because I happen to agree that at the end of the day, the story will be more rewarding if it is emotionally resonant, and you can't get an emotionally you can't get an emotionally resonant story with 20 authors.
Yeah, because there is a reason that fiction authors have a job, which is that they can curate a narrative. Yeah,
right. And now what you can do is have a story choice, have it matter, because the story choice happens, and then you start to, in the near to distant future, see the ramifications of that story choice as the next, arc of the story is planned out with the knowledge of what this story choice result was, right?
Yeah.
We saw that with Totori making the choice to investigate his assassins instead of going after the prince or going to the monastery, or
the other option that wasn't chosen.
What was the third one? Oh,
I don't remember.
I blanked. Wow, bad.
No, it's fine because it wasn't chosen. It wasn't the chosen option.
Yeah,
so it's a what if that never happened. It's your Disney Plus story.
And to be sure, as the person who kind of orchestrated all those outcomes, they had very, very different impacts on what the long-term story is. And so as we see more ramifications of that particular story choice, it will become very clear that, like, this decision mattered, and it was intentionally woven into the story rather than just like a one-off.
I mean, in terms of long-term,
happened one time and got one result.
No, I mean those things should definitely be impactful. I mean, in terms of like long-term planning for the story, is there? I mean, to any extent, do you follow what's happening in terms of the card game meta or people's decisions? Like, if say Scorpion splash Phoenix for a year, right? Splashing their darkest display of power spell magics and their, all of that sort of stuff. At some point, does that mean that Scorpions start, stealing Phoenix spells or something? Or do you just try and detach them completely and just focus on what takes the better narrative?
the short honest answer is I am most interested in taking what makes for the best narrative. Um, I certainly look for inspiration from card game results where I can,
Okay.
but I'm averse to the Shadowlands approach of old, where a deck was irrevocably marked as tainted for running X many
Yeah.
Shadowlands, and that became reflected in the story because like what is powerful in the game and what makes for good storytelling have nothing to do with each
No, I agree with that for sure.
other.
And also,
And
people should be punished for putting good cards in their decks by having the whole clan tainted. I mean, that's not a
right,
feels
yeah,
good moment,
and
right?
that feels just as bad. It almost feels like, yeah, I won the tournament, but at what cost? And now, if that's the feeling I'm trying to go for, then
I mean, that
sweet.
itself is a powerful feeling for a player
But
to
that's
have.
not usually what I'm trying to do,
No.
right? I want people to feel rewarded for doing the thing that they want to do. I don't want to punish people for doing the thing that they want to do. I'm not inclined to say, "Good job, you got the Emperor's sword. Now have it in your gut." Right? But that doesn't mean that I can't find inspiration, in unexpected or interesting places, right? Take for example, the Toshi Ranbo Jade Mines going to the crab. That was honestly, here's a fun story. There was a point during the Toshi Ranbo series when Scorpion was winning, uh, that Scorpion players online in a private space that I was able to observe uh, were talking about the possibility of like, could we organize our clan like unanimously enough to convince the developers that the Scorpion clan wants to give the Jade Mines to the crab, even though we want it. And I was like, that's a cool story. Now, obviously, they didn't try the social engineering necessary to try to make that actually happen. But I was like, that's a cool story. There's something interesting there. And it came from the players. Like, they don't know that until I just now told this story. But like,
Okay, yeah.
But
we won't take Big Brother Tyler is always listening. We'll just take the sometimes cool ideas creep into your brain from wherever you see them. We'll take that that position on that. I think.
Sure, I guess that's
no. I'm just joking.
The way I told that story.
No, because I know and you know that you can't read every conversation and every chat ever, so people shouldn't expect you to see something and be like, "Oh, that's really good. I'll include this." But it is interesting, I guess, to see that inspiration from player discussion does make it into the story in some way.
And the other thing is that if a particular clan is winning a lot in the game, or a particular character is winning a lot in the game, then there's a very fine balance between making people feel like their choices were reflected in the story, which is cool, or making people feel like, oh man, that deck or that character that was like the scourge of the metagame that I'm so glad is finally gone, and now here they are doing all of that again in the storyline.
Yeah,
like there is a certain amount of success fatigue.
Yeah,
that I would not want to tread too far on.
I think that's fair, because if you restrict, for example, you restrict City, that's knocked Scorpion back a bit, and Scorpion are still paramount in the fiction, so the two colliding at the same time does have an impact on how people feel about the Scorpion clan, because it's showed you winning, showed you winning, showed you winning, showed you winning some more.
And to be fair, like, we did intentionally build that in to the three now Kote series. The idea of like, here's this card game prize that a clan will win, and the clan will also win that prize in the fiction. But that was done much more, in a much more controlled way than just kind of, well, Mitsu's in all the dragon decks, so I guess Mitsu's going to be our protagonist. If Mitsu isn't the most interesting protagonist, I happen to like Mitsu, but that
he's not as nuanced as some of the other dragons, but he does have his moments.
But let's put it this way. We still haven't seen Mirumoto Raitsu go in a story. And he was the dragon character for the first 2 years of the game.
That is true. Yeah, he was. And he hasn't appeared in any fiction, which makes me wonder what he's doing.
And like, I have some ideas, but also the thing about telling a story is you got to approach its story first.
Yeah, I
And
think that's fair.
it's awesome to be able to weave in inspiration or weave in player involvement as is appropriate. But if you go too far down that road, then the story stops being resonant. And having a resonant story is our number one goal.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And then in terms of designing the cycles and sets to reflect what's going to happen in the story, it's just a case of putting in the relevant characters and having them have, we'll say, thematic abilities and
feel like they do what they're doing. Well, and the other thing is, player involvement in the story does influence the design of the cards, right? That's how you end up with Kuwanan and Hotaru fighting each other and then being incompatible in the game. But cards are designed like a year. The Dominion cycle was finalized a year ago.
So is there? Is there a divide then in terms of is story planned out, say 6 months, and cycles are planned out a year in advance, for example? Is there a gap there, or is it?
Yeah, so that means that my options are either design and playtest multiple versions of a particular card that's attached to a story choice, which has been done in the past, or wait until after the story choice is made, but before the design for the set has begun, which means we're talking about a story choice that doesn't see card design ramifications for like a year and a half, maybe.
Yeah, which is kind of too long, really.
Which, that's not rewarding either, but that's kind of all that is possible for player story choice to impact card design.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, you can do it much shorter with just purely a fiction result. We saw the result or the follow up to the Winter Court story choice a month ago.
Yeah.
Because we started on that fiction immediately after Winter Court, right? Whereas if I had started on a card set based on that story choice at the same time, we still wouldn't be seeing it until at least the end of the year.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There's got to be a balance there between the two impacting each other, just because of how the design syncs up in terms of. It's not easier to write a story than it is to design a card. I don't know, which you think is easier, but just in terms of, it's very easy to write a story and put it up online than it is to print a card and ship it to lots of people. Yeah. So I'm just conscious we come up on about an hour and a bit now. We talked a bit about time. We talked a bit about coreset. Is there anything else you kind of want to add in on those topics, or?
No, I think we actually took several detours, which were fruitful, but covered whatever else I would want to say on the matter.
Okay. The main things for me, I think the time thing has been very well addressed. The coreset one, I think, will just remain there as the question. I think everyone will be interested to see how FFG approaches that moving forwards, because, entry into the game is just a hot topic, because...
Entry into the game is hard. There's no sugarcoating it. And there are a lot of things that I would like to do. There are a lot of ideas that I have, and a lot of them are not feasible for various reasons, but some of them hopefully are. And a lot of, the whole L5R has really just embraced this idea of experimentation with the LCG model from day one. The role mechanic, 6 packs in 6 weeks, this whole we're just gonna try things because the way that we've been doing competitive LCGs in the past has not been 100% successful, so let's try new things and see what works.
I think that's
and
fair.
A certain amount of that will be necessary because this is because the barrier to entry to LCGs just gets difficult a few years into the game, and so finding new ways to do that without invalidating what came before is the real challenge.
I think that's the thing. I think that's the thing that most people spend their times trying to brainstorm around. Anyway, thank you, Tyler, for joining me. I hope people have found this interesting. I know I certainly have. But it's good to sit down and sort of have these discussions. And if you have any other questions I won't say if you have any other questions for Tyler. Don't bombard Tyler with questions. But if you have any questions about the video, then you can leave them in the comments, and I'll see if he can address any of them. All right. Thanks, everyone, and talk to you soon.